Shalom everyone, you're here again for another episode of Tzar Mikra. I hope you've enjoyed the previous recordings and you've learned something from them. And this week we are in Parashat Behar, Behar Sinai. And in truth, this is a very, how would I put it, a very interesting subject, because there's a lot of discussion about the subjects which come up in this parasha the last couple of months, because for us here in Israel, we've actually finished the Shemitah year, and there actually are groups of people who want to claim that the Shemitah year started literally a couple of weeks ago with the beginning of the first month. And there's a lot of material about this subject which have been shared, especially by Nehemiah Golden, who sent me actually files of this material, and a lot of calculations that people made about when the Shemitah year is and when the Jubilee is, and then we have the Book of Jubilees, which is very, very interesting subject by itself. And it's always been this question of calendar. Calendar has always been a very, very big issue for many, many people throughout the centuries. And when exactly things are, and how do we do this and how we do that, has been something I think on the mind of many, many people all the time throughout the ages. Now, I did a program which you can find on the recordings, either on the SoundCloud or on the website. Actually, not the SoundCloud, on the website and on YouTube. For SoundCloud, I haven't edited that recording yet for SoundCloud. And I go over the history of some calendars and how calendars really came to be from the perspective of humanity. And really, having control over the calendar, deciding when things happen, is a very, very powerful tool. I mean, think about it that, for example, in a world where we pay taxes, many of us at least pay taxes, and when the taxes are given has a very strong hold on our life, because it kind of tells us when we can and can't do certain things. And we know that we make our money, but then government walks in and says, listen, you have to pay your taxes at this time or that time. And every time something changes or they put you under a certain pressure, that has a lot of hold on us as people. And it's throughout the centuries, there's always been this conflict or this tension between when things are supposed to be according to the bigger world that surrounds us versus what we actually can do in our personal lives. There are times where taxes are taken at a very, very uncomfortable time for us personally, but for the government, they don't really care. This is the time where you pay taxes, or if they raise taxes suddenly in the middle of the year, a whole bunch of different things. But basically, that's the one of the most common things for us in our world today. In the ancient world, there's a very similar principle. I mean, the world hasn't really changed that much. It's just technology has changed, but human nature and human behavior hasn't changed at all. And back then, when a feast happens, when when you take your taxes, these were strongly controlled by temples, which were basically part of the government. We've always had in history this connection between the throne and the temple, throne and temple connection all the time. And kings always tried to be somehow influential inside temples, first of all for their own personal devotions, but also, again, knowing that religion is a very, very powerful driving tool in the world people live in. So they always were very, very involved. They actually regulated sometimes what was going on in the temples. And for example, in the Second Temple, in the Jewish Second Temple, the Romans controlled the temple itself. For them, by the way, that was quite normal. For Israelites, for Jews, this was not normal, because there was actually a certain separation between the throne and the temple. The temple actually functioned independently, especially in the Second Temple, functioned independently from the throne. And the Romans stepped in and said, no, we're going to tell you when, who, and how, because for them, the temple was just another social function. For us, it's part of the covenant, it's part of our religious reality as something that we perceive as having to be separate. For them, it was a very strong social function that they said that the government always has the ability to control, because the Romans were obsessed with the idea of order and the law and the written law that forced everyone into a very, very specific box. And the Israelite faith is obviously has its own box and everything, but there is a certain separation between different elements, where the high priest is not bound to the king. It's actually the other way around. The king has to sometimes answer to more religious authorities. For the Romans, it was the other way around. But I'm actually kind of stepping ahead into something completely different now. But in any case, the year itself, the what's known as the Shnat Shemitah, from the word shamat, which is to drop, to leave something, which is a year where there's a shmitat chovot, you forget someone owes you money, and you also you leave your land to be for an entire year, and you're not allowed to harvest and so on, and that creates a lot of questions. People go, how can you even live like this? How can you do stuff like that? And first of all, let's understand that in faith there are always things that you do which are unusual, that people think that are not normal. But at the end of the day, we need to remember that if you are in a covenant, and this is part of the idea, if you're in a covenant with someone and he gives you stipulations, then obviously you have to practice these stipulations, and you have to keep them, and that's the leading principle here. But what's more intriguing to me, and I think this is a very there's a big thing that's raised nowadays in a lot of circles, is when do you keep Shemitah, where do you keep Shemitah, and how you actually keep Shemitah. Let's try to focus on these three questions. So when do you keep Shemitah? People who are more inclined to the methodology of the Book of Jubilees, which is clearly a very, very late book. It's a very late book. I've read the Book of Jubilees, and there are a lot of things that jump out of the pages which are clearly not biblical. There are even things mentioned there that cannot be historically from the first temple or times of Joshua, whatever it might be. And this is not the first occurrence that we have something like this. There are loads of books that show up throughout the centuries that people claim were written by people in antiquity. I mean, very, very early antiquity, but the language, the style, the ideas, the principles, and the sources they were taking things from are clearly very, very late. Book of Jubilees, for example, actually has references to disputes which were clearly going on during the Second Temple, and ideas of angels, a very highly developed understanding of angels, which is not fitting to the First Temple. And even if you even say early, it doesn't even fit even earlier to that. The ideology behind it is very sectarian, very Second Temple sectarian way of thinking. There's even a mentioning there of a dispute between the high priest in Jerusalem and whomever's leader that wrote this book with that leader, a dispute that's clearly in the Second Temple, part of the struggle between the sectarian groups. And so it's very, I'm not going to do a deep study here of Jubilees, but as a person who deals with historical documents, I could see it almost immediately. About a year ago, someone actually published here in Israel a Hebrew version of the Book of Jubilees with a lot of notes. Like each chapter, if a chapter covers about a page or two, the notes are something like 20 pages per chapter. So it's a very large, thick book. And I was going through some of the references in this book, and it was very clear that the commentators concluded that this is a very, very late book, and that's actually the general understanding. But there are people who are not historians, who are not trained in document understanding, who are not trained in understanding how any of this material even came to be, that work with these books and come up with these ideas that these are ancient books that should be in the Bible and so on. how books were taken in and out of the Bible is a very, very good question. There are multiple theories about this, how canonization happened and so on. But the one thing that I think I found very, very interesting is that what was canonized were books that everyone agreed were biblical. The question started off with books which were placed in question. All these books, did everyone accept them or not? The fact that they were part of the Jewish library is not questioned. That people might have had copies of the Book of Jubilees that they had in their houses as part of Jewish literature. The same way today, a lot of households have a Talmud in their house, though maybe no one ever reads it. But a lot of houses have like different, a lot of Jewish literature, but it's never held like a Bible. It's never considered to be like the rest of the Tanakh. But people had these books because it was part of the living literature. It's like having any other type of book in your house, except for the fact that back then many Jews didn't hold in their houses, anything besides Jewish literature. So everything had some kind of a holiness to them. If I take a Mishnah Berurah, which is a very, very common book, but it's a very late book, was written about 100 years ago. And, I compare it to the Tanakh. Obviously, the Tanakh takes precedent over the Mishnah Berurah. But this was still something a lot of people had in their houses, like the Ben Sirah books and probably the Sefer Hanoch or Enoch, and a whole lot of other things. And it was part of the Jewish library, but it wasn't necessarily held as scripture. This is something Menachem Haran kind of presents. He says that, what was considered scripture probably became scripture the moment it was written, while other books, which were not considered scripture, were still considered part of the Jewish library, but never received the status of scripture at any stage, except for sectarian groups that wanted these books to be a very leading principle in the world they lived in. So they kind of wrote in a biblical style, and I say style deliberately because the imitation of certain things wasn't always 100% fluent, and there are things that they cause it to look like biblical Hebrew, but then it screams out, "I'm not biblical Hebrew," because you can see types of words or syntax that they use which are clearly not from biblical times. And but basically, it's in the idea of the Book of Jubilees. The basic idea is that there's these gigantic cycles that everything goes by, and things have to happen in very, very specific times. And this is what we call predetermination. Predetermination is part of a larger idea that was very, very, very sectarian. There's a professor of Second Temple Studies called Nitzan. She used to teach in the Tel Aviv University. I think she's retired now. And she wrote a book that came out about 2 years ago, I think it was, about this entire world. And she builds up an entire thesis from basically the first page. But one of the things that she says that it's a very ongoing theme in all these sectarian books is this idea of predetermination. Everything is predetermined. And that's really the principle that appears in the Book of Jubilees. So it really raises the question of, do you really have any free will? Do you have any control on anything? Do your actions really mean anything? It gets woven into the whole idea of the sons of light against the sons of darkness, that you don't really have control on who you are. You're either from the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and you are predetermined to be one of those groups. So basically, your actions mean absolutely nothing. And you can be a son of darkness and still be a good person, but at the end of the day, when we reach the final showdown, then you will, whatever good deeds you have don't really mean that much, because of the fact that you are part of the sons of darkness. And then you can have a person, a son of light, and he can be a nasty person, but he's still part of the sons of light. This predetermined predestination principle that takes away your free will, takes away from the possibility of ever entering heaven or whatever it might be, because of the fact that you're being predetermined. And no one holds to the book of Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. I mean, it's a book that everyone agrees is sectarian. So I find it very intriguing the Book of Jubilees became such a prominent book for many, many people. And I think the reason this happened is because certain churches like the book. Certain churches, it fits some of their apocalyptic ideas that they lived by, which are fitting into some principles which are put in the New Testament. And remember one time I sat down, someone said to me, "Oh, you should read the New Testament because it's you might learn something about Second Temple Jewry." And I said, I agree with that. So I sat down. I didn't just read; I actually kind of like dissected. I remember I reached the last book of the New Testament, can't even remember what it's called now. So the book of not the book of John, it's the book of Revelation. And I remember reading through it, and I said, "This book is really, really, really strange. It's very different than the rest of the rest of the New Testament." But what it was very clear to me is that this book fits into that niche of the apocalyptic books. And apocalypse, by the way, it means revelation. It doesn't mean destruction. It means revelation, divine revelation. And it really fit into that niche of books, which are, book of Jubilees, book of Enoch. It really does fit into that world, which kind of tells us that there were plenty of people out there that were felt very close to this style of books. And and that's probably why the book of Jubilees and the book of Enoch, being part of that niche, survived. Now, the book of Jubilees, as far as I know, really mostly survived. There are no Hebrew versions of this book until they were rediscovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were Ethiopian versions, but both Jubilee and Enoch. Enoch also has a Serbian version, and even the book. There's a whole bunch of books that kind of end up in Europe as well, and more in the Russian areas. And there are books that survived in Africa, and books that survived in the Santa Catarina church in Mount Sinai. So things did survive, but they only survived inside the Christian world. In the Jewish world, they were completely abandoned at one point, and there's a big question why they were abandoned. And one of the ideas was that it was because they became kind of like owned by the Christian world. Jews just decided to completely just drop these books. Though they were very interesting to them, they dropped them. But on the other hand, the books like the Covenant of Damascus, Sefer Brit Damesek, which actually survived. There was even a copy of it, maybe even several copies of it, found in the Cairo Gniza, which is a Gniza of 1,000 years later. It's a Gniza that existed from around, I think it was the 10th century to the 12th century, something like that. And when it was opened up by Solomon Schechter back in the 1930s, I think it was, they found a copy of it, a complete Hebrew copy. So some books did still circle inside the Jewish world. Some of them were actually completely pushed out. And what's interesting is Jubilees and Chanoch were both pushed out of the Jewish circles. First of all, probably as an act of protection against apocalyptic writings that might lead people to crazy things, especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and also probably because of the split between Judaism and Christianity that probably kind of ended somewhere around the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. That was probably the final nail in the coffin of the possibility of Jews, or Pharisaic Jews and Christian Jews interacting with one another. And the reason was, by the way, because the Christian Jews refused to join the Bar Kokhba army. So that probably really, really, really annoyed a whole bunch of people back then. And there are even descriptions that we have from church fathers that Bar Kokhba actually did physically attack these Christians as basically Roman supporters. But in any case, one of the problems that we have is keeping the when. When exactly does it happen? Now, the calculation that we use today is only about 800 years old. It's a calculation done by Maimonides to try to calculate exactly when the Jubilee is. But the thing is that besides his opinion that most Jews go by, there is an opinion by the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, that actually puts it a year before. And now we have this new calculation that shows up that puts it a year after. And the truth be told, we can't even prove who's right and who's wrong here. We only have, what the majority of Jews do, and then two opinions that show up. Now, my personal opinion about this subject is as follows. if we go according to the logic of the Book of Jubilees, which is the reason I brought up the entire subject of the Book of Jubilees was to use it to explain this. If we go according to the logic of the Book of Jubilees, then there's a clear cycle from creation times all the way to the end of days, that everything has to fit into these cycles of 50 years. And therefore, it has to be a very, very, very precise time. And this is why when Joshua entered the land, it had to be at a very specific time of the year to fit a very specific cycle. So I would say probably they entered on, I think the calculation is that they ended at the end of a Jubilee. I think that's how it's calculated. And then 7 years later, they kept a sabbatical year. So they entered in the first year after the 50th year. And there's actually a debate. Does the 50th year belong to is like an in-between? Is the 50th year the first year of the next cycle? Or is it something separate? And there are, again, different opinions about it. My opinion is that the 50th year is a 50th year, and then the next year is the beginning of a new first-year cycle. So you basically have 2 consecutive years where you're not allowed to do any work on the land. And then, if you work according to the Jubilee cycle, then it has to fall in a very, very specific time of the year. Maimonides does something very, very similar. He tries to calculate from the times of Joshua all the way to his time and gives an approximation and says this and that. The thing is that, for example, headstones which were discovered in Tzohar, near the Dead Sea, give us dates which are different, which move the Jubilee years to a different place. There is documentation of keeping the Jubilee at a different time, basically showing that Maimonides was actually wrong. And people say, oh, look, Maimonides is wrong. My response to that is that it's quite possible that even back then there were different practices, that there was a dispute over when you keep the Jubilee. So a certain group that lived near the Dead Sea kept it at this time, and then maybe another group that lived somewhere else kept it at another time. So I don't think that that's 100% evidence, though it is physical evidence that shows that there was something else that existed in times of Maimonides. We need to remember that as a person who deals with historical documents, we need to remember that the fact that I found a document like this sheds light on what people practice, but understanding that there is the possibility that there were other practices at the time. But we also have to remember that Maimonides did sit and do his own calculation, and that calculation can be wrong as well. Okay, so we're still left here hanging somewhere. My opinion of this is I completely reject the whole Book of Jubilees idea. You actually need to completely reject that whole idea, and I think that there's actually a thing called a restart button, that you can reset the whole thing. And you can restart it from the point where you re-enter the land, or that you decide that we're going to start counting from here. So this basically says that even if we say that the Maimonides was completely wrong in his calculation, which is a very, very plausible idea in my opinion, maybe even 100% correct that he was wrong, it doesn't matter. Because this cycle, unlike the cycle of the week, where there's the first day of creation, then the seventh day, and this is an ongoing cycle, and the seventh day is always at the same time, here this depends on us sitting on the land. This is not like the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees works on a principle like the weekly cycle, that there's clearly from creation to the seventh day, and then seventh day happens, count another seven. It's an ongoing cycle that doesn't stop at any given moment. That's the Sabbath cycle. The cycle, the unstoppable cycle of the Shemitah and the Yovel is dependent on presence of Israel on the land, which means the moment you are removed from the land, the cycle is broken. You don't continue counting from the moment you enter the land from the time of Joshua. That counting has been broken, has been completely severed. The covenant has been severed to some degree, not completely severed, but severed to some degree. And when you're sitting outside of the land in exile, there's no cycle to keep there. It's not on the land, which, by the way, deals with this question of the where. But then when you re-enter, you've started the cycle from from scratch again. You start a cycle again. So then the land was desolate again from probably around the 9th century, because the church invented this whole thing. The land was desolate. There were Jews living here for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the church invented a history that Jews were completely expelled from the land after the destruction of the Second Temple. That is a complete and utter myth. It is a myth the church invented to try to make itself, very important and try to glorify itself. But at the end of the day, Jews were in the land until the Crusades. There were still, even when the community really started dying out towards the Crusades in 1095, when Urban II declared a crusade, which the whole story of how the Crusades were declared is a big joke. There were several things, but one of them was that the Byzantine emperor was getting beat by the Muslims, and he turned around to the Pope and said, "We want your help." And the Pope said, "Hey, this is a great opportunity to show that we, the Western Church, the Catholic Church, are more powerful." And then he made different promises to a lot of people. "Oh, if you go on this crusade, those who reach Jerusalem will enter heaven." Basically making stuff up to get people to create an army. When the crusade started, obviously we know that they killed a lot of Jews on the way, and Jews fled the land of Israel. And that was the end of the Jewish population for about 300 years, maybe even less, maybe for about 100 years, I would say. And there were probably some Jews still sitting here, but not too many. And then after Salahuddin came in 1187 and defeated the Christian army, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, then Jews were allowed back in, because Salahuddin was a bit more tolerant about certain things, and they started slowly coming back in. So by the 14th, 15th century, there's already a large Jewish population back here. So there's only a very, very small window when Jews were not living in the land, but there have been Jews living here since the times of Joshua. So just to let you know the historical record of this matter. But in any case, basically you can reset. If you lose a count, then you reset. The Talmud goes into this discussion. What does a person who was stranded in a desert, basically say he's stuck in a place where there's no civilization, he has no idea what day of the week it is. So they say in such a situation, until he finds civilization, he still needs to keep a 7th-day Sabbath, because he still has a covenant to keep. And therefore, he starts counting, and if he's lost his count, he doesn't remember what day it is of the week, he starts counting 7 days and keeps the 7th day as a Sabbath until he discovers when everything is. In our case, we've lost the count, so we can either say one of two things. We can say we try to do a calculation like Maimonides did, or we say we reset the button, and we reset the button. And in this case, again, unlike the weekly cycle where it's a fixed day, here it's very dependent on the presence of Israel on the land and basically keeping the covenant on the land. So I think that the principles here are actually kind of different than one another. And then from that cycle, you also open up the Jubilee cycle. So this cycle is closely dependent on covenant and sinning on the land, and it's not like the Sabbath, which is something which is independent of everything. The Sabbath is there no matter what. God sanctified the Sabbath before everything even existed. Before there was Israel, before there was anything, there was only Adam and Eve, and God said, "This is my day of rest," and that's it. This is something which is independent of anyone. And then God gave that as a covenant to Israel. You keep that day as being it's called the imitation of the divine. Imitatio Deo, I think it's called, the Latin term is that you imitate the divine by keeping a 7th day, and by that you become his representative. In any case, that's my opinion of the when. Now the where, as I said, it's strongly connected to the covenant of Abraham, which is a covenant of a land and basically entering the land. And it actually says in verse 2, Daber el bnei Israel, chapter 25, verse 2, V'amart alem ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten v'shavta haaretz Shabbat l'Adonai. When you enter the land, when you come to the land which I give to you, the land will cease on a Sabbath. So it's clear this is actually on the land. Now, when people want to, for example, I meet people who say, "Oh, I'm going to keep a sabbatical year where I live," That's perfectly fine. That is perfectly fine. I really have no problem with people doing certain practices outside of the land as a memorial. That's fine. It's actually great. It's great practice. It's very honorable that people do that. I really don't think there's anything wrong with that. But when people turn around to others and say you have to keep the seventh day, the sabbatical year or the jubilee year in where you live, when you say you have to, that's where we hit a wall. That's actually a problem. You can't force that on others, because this is strongly connected to the principle of covenant of sitting on the actual land. Outside of the land, it isn't. Now, for me, as a Jew living on the land, it's what we say, it's a simple idea that no one thinks about. But today in our world, where people are trying to find spirituality wherever they can because of the spirituality crisis of the last about 300-400 years, everyone's trying to feel special outside the land, and it created this. And I know this to be a true movement, and I really have no problem with this movement. But people who try to extend everything to wherever they live, to a point, for example, I wrote on Facebook that we don't really have spring here in Israel, and therefore using the term Aviv to indicate spring, it's actually incorrect grammatically and historically and this reality. And someone wrote back to me, but we have spring in the United States, and that's how it ends. And I'm like, I know you have spring in the United States, but what does that have to do with the principle of finding Aviv in the land of Israel? So there is this unfortunate tension, I think, slowly building up between the idea of living in the land and understanding that the covenant, there are many principles of the covenant which are dependent on sitting on the land that God promised Abraham, basically what we can call an ethnocentric, nationalistic, specific location principle, versus the more universal, multi-ethnic, non-specific locative principle that a lot of people are living by. But then I'll raise the question is, okay, so why don't you build a temple where you live? If it's not dependent on a specific location, then why, there's basically what I consider to be an oxymoron, is so why don't you say that you can have a new Jerusalem somewhere else? So obviously, the New Jerusalem is going to come down from heaven, but even if it comes down from heaven, it's going to go to a very specific place. So you're still living by a certain oxymoron. And my intention here is not to create any more tension. I'm just saying, just sit and think for a moment about what you claim. But once again, when people tell me, we want to keep the covenant outside of the land, 100% I'm with you. Go for it. Do it. I have no problem with that. A friend of mine put the post up and said, if everything is only in the land, then we're allowed to do everything outside the land. And the truth is, there were people who believed this. There were people who said that we're now in exile. When we're outside the land, we don't have to keep anything. And there were movements like this. So as one person said, if you don't have to keep Sabbath outside the land, then you can also go to prostitutes. And they specifically used the example of prostitution. And I said, these are actually things which are not limited in space or time. These are things, Shabbat is specific space, specific time, but none of these things are limited in space. These are things that can be taken outside. There are just things like tithing and the sabbatical year and the jubilee and laws about owning specific land when it comes to the division between the tribes and everything that actually are limited to the land. Tithing, by the way, is a very, very interesting thing, because really when you look at the Torah, it really talks about mostly to do with tithing from the land. And this leads a lot of people to saying, we don't have to tithe at all. And anyone who knows me knows I'm not a very big advocate of tithing. I say, if you feel that what the teacher does has blessed you, then, you should show support, because most of us put up the material for free, except for, some websites or certain things are closed sections and you have to go in and pay a tuition or something, but the majority is for free. So I never tell people, when people are, I want to give you my tithe, I'm like, okay, I'm a Levite, so in my case, I live in the land, so in my case it's a little bit easier than that. But I usually warn people, say, don't call it a tithe, it's told a gift or a donation or something, and when you give to teachers and everything, because you don't want to go into that corner of calling it a tithe and then, telling people they have to tithe outside of the land and so on, and also, calling a tithe and the person is not a Levite, then it's there is a problem there. So that's in regards to the where. Now the how is, I think the how is pretty straightforward. It says, on the seventh year there's a Shabbaton. You don't harvest anything. You don't plow. You don't harvest. And plow and harvest is a merismus, which means it takes the two ends of something. A merismus is a principle of taking the two ends of something, and then it includes everything in between. So you're not supposed to you're not supposed to plow. You're not supposed to harvest, which also applies to trees, whatever work you do with trees and so on. And then you basically, anyone can go into your field and pick and eat from it, because a lot of grains grow voluntarily, and trees continue to produce fruit, and whatever plants you might have planted throughout the years will grow. And people can just go in. Now, obviously, there's a responsibility. You're not going to go into a field and start destroying the field and harming the field. Oh, look, we're allowed to go in this field to pick fruit. Start climbing the trees and breaking the trees. That's damage. That's not what the Torah allows you to do. What it allows you to do is go in respectfully and pick whatever you need and what you need. Not start gathering quantities and then running home and taking from an entire field several metric tons or several tons of whatever produce it is and take it to your house and just sit there now and have it in your house. That's not the intention either. The intention is that you can go in, you pick a normal quantity that will last you a day or two, or maybe 3 days, or even a week, and that's it. You're not supposed to start accumulating it in your house, and basically because you can take certain fruits and dry them, or grains and dry them, and then suddenly you can start buying and selling and bartering with it. That's not the intention. The intention is to enable you to eat. And this was a society that they didn't live like we do, where we I grew up, unfortunately, like this a little bit, but, you basically, what you got on the same day, that's what you eat. And there was a time in my life where that was the reality I lived by. Every day, I didn't know what I was going to eat. I was already an adult back then, but basically, it was the period when I was homeless. And I would sometimes have to every time if someone gave me some food, I was able to get some money and buy food. I was always buy things in cans, so I know that if tomorrow or a couple of days down the road I won't be able to find another meal, I know I have these cans in my backpack, or these cans in the little room that I had at one point that someone gave me, that I'll have food in the future. And you have to kind of think like that, because who are the type of people who go into a field and start gleaning from a field? Mostly poor people. And if you've never been poor, you don't understand this principle. I've been poor. I've been homeless. I had times where I would have, if I'm lucky, a one meal a day, and until someone kind of realized I was homeless and kind of said, okay, they started helping me out, and I was always looking for work. I mean, it wasn't a reality that I was sitting around whining about the fact that I'm homeless. I mean, I've been working nonstop from around the age of 18. But the whole idea is that you don't know what's the next thing, and this is how these types of people live. You don't know what's going to be the next day, but on the other hand, you can't abuse the help that you're given. If I was someone say, oh, we got a couple, they let me into a storage room and they say, oh, you can take some things here to store in your room, so you always have some food there. I can't go in and start, filling up my bag and, taking, 30 cans of tuna and 50 cans of no, I had to take a normal quantity. I had to take something that will last me a week or two. And then 2 weeks later, they say, okay, are you running low on something? Do you need anything else? You have to respect the goodness that people give you. And, remember seeing, beggars on the streets of Jerusalem, for example, and I never give to them. And the reason is, I actually know some of the stories of these people, and I know that what's going on with them is a complete lie. So, I do this personally because I have personal knowledge. If I don't know the person, I don't know who they are, I'll give them money. But when you give them 5 shekels and they say, oh, you give me a 20, say, no, it doesn't work like that. You can't abuse the kindness of people. And that's basically how this would work. The Jubilee itself is a very unique thing, because the Jubilee, the Yovel, has a much bigger meaning to it. And after 7 cycles of 7 years, on the 50th year, we actually have a practice known as the dro, which is also known from the ancient East as dararum, which is the same word, which means freedom. You declare freedom in the land. Anyone who is a slave is released. Anyone that had land that they had to sell because they couldn't make ends meet, that land returns to the owners. Everything is basically what we call a reset button. Everyone and everything is put back into their original condition. And that's one of the main things of the Jubilee year, that you have that reset button that returns everything to where it was. Because as I've mentioned in earlier recordings, one of the main principles of the Torah is the idea of keeping order, bringing order to the universe. We begin with order in the book of Genesis, and this order goes throughout the entire structure of Torah, that things have to be in their rightful place. And obviously sometimes, things turn out of their rightful place out of a need. For example, we have the case, for example, of Elisha, that he tells the armies to destroy trees and to block all water and everything. And the reason Elisha, this is in the book of Kings, the battles between the king of Israel, Judah, and Edom against the king of Moab. And the reason he does is because sometimes in a reality of chaos has to continue to exist in order to bring order back. So there are situations where you have to make hard decisions, or decisions that normally are forbidden according to Torah. But what happens is every once in a while there's a reset button. The universe gets reset and everything goes back into its place. And the whole idea is that on the Jubilee, on Yom, what's interesting, it's done on Yom Kippurim, B'asor HaChodesh b'Yom Kippurim. This is verse 9. Ta'aviru shofar b'chotzachem. You pass a shofar throughout the entire land. There's a declaration. Everyone, if this is done privately by individuals, or there actually are representatives of the high priest, representatives of the temple, go around the land calling everyone, telling everyone it's supposed to happen, and they blow the shofar as a declarative sound, because b'chol artzachem, it's not, the declaration goes throughout the entire land. So this has to happen with messengers, because everyone has to let everyone know, because they have to reinforce Torah. So, for example, I live in the Galilee, and if the temple is in Jerusalem, or at other time it's Shiloh, I don't necessarily know exactly when everything will be. I don't necessarily know exactly what year it is, or last time there was a Jubilee, it was at my father's time. My father's no longer here, and there's no one who remembers this, because people back then didn't necessarily live that long. And, so they have to keep an account of it. And keeping accounts of calendars in temples was, again, very, very normal. We said in the beginning that it was connected to cities and temples. And I strongly recommend just go listen to the recording on Parashat Bo. And, they have to come out and tell us, it's the 50th year. Oh, okay, so what do we do in the 50th year? And this is where I think a lot of the little Levitical cities, which are also spiritual centers, where religious centers come into play as well, they get a message that comes into them, and then the Levites go out and tell everyone else around them. So, for example, I as a Levite, I would probably live more in a place like Yokneam, which is just down the road from where I live, and I would leave my home and start going around the valley that I live in, if it's the valley of Jezreel or the valley of Zebulun, which are basically two valleys side by side. So, for example, Megiddo and Israel, the two cities are only about half an hour, 40 minutes away from where I live. And I will go to these major cities and go to the area and just basically tell everyone, blow the shofar and get everyone's attention, and then tell them what's going on. And then the same thing also with the sabbatical year. It says, Lo tizru, lo tiktziru et tzefechea, lo tivtziru et nezirea. This is verse 11. You will not seed, and you will not harvest, and you will not harvest it's anything that's a volunteer, because safiach is and the safiach and the nazirim are basically the things that grow out even without planting and so on. And obviously the Torah goes into this whole question of the question of faith. We're not going to work for 2 years straight. What are we going to live off of? And he says, the Torah says, you're going to have abundant quantities. And what's very interesting is that for several years now in a row, I've always seen this article that on the 6th year before, and this is not made up. This is stuff that I've actually heard from farmers. They say that on the 6th year of the cycle that we use in Judaism, the quantities are suddenly huge. like massive, massive quantities, more than usual. There's more rain than usual. There's more abundant food and so on. Now, everyone tries to point out that, look, according to our calculation, that's happened as well. But the fact remains, as an ongoing cycle for at least three cycles of Shemitah that at least I've lived through, maybe even four, I would say. Probably four. This has happened consistently. So this is a lot more consistent than someone now, the last couple of years, decided. This is saying, oh, look, we found these gigantic grapevines. And gigantic grapevines are not evidence. This is something that has a lot more credibility, and it's actually being documented for quite a while now. But basically the Torah promises, this is a walk of faith. You're in a covenant with God, and this is a walk of faith. Now, the rest of this parasha actually deals a lot with redeeming your brother. If your brother is put into a problematic situation, then actually it's your responsibility to redeem them. And it actually goes into, if a person loses his land, if a person has to sell their land, their home, what do you do? So if it's connected directly to the land, if it's someone's land, house with property, then it's part of the property and therefore part of the land, and it goes into that reset button. But then cities, for example, which were not, they sat on land, but cities which were already a different establishment that was not connected to specifically sitting on family properties, then there's no reset button. If a year passes, it doesn't go back. Actually, if you want it back, you have to buy it back. But then we also have what are you allowed to do and not allowed to do when your brother borrows money. So it's very interesting here is the Torah never says you have a commandment to give charity. You have a commandment to help your brother. If you decide to give charity out of your own pocket, then that's your decision. But when the Torah says here that the commandment to help your brother, monetary help, is when you lend your brother money. You don't have to give. There's no Torah command to give charity. That's out of the kindness of your heart. That's loving thy brother as thyself, as the King James Version says, "Ve'ahavta l'ra'acha kamocha." But the commandment of the Torah is not to give charity, to give a loan. But after 7 years, or after if the Shemitah year passes, then that turns into charity if your brother has not given it back to you. So this is obviously a warning also to people who receive the loan. Don't abuse the law. Don't take the law and use it to benefit from taking a loan and then say, oh, the 7th year's here, I don't have to give it back to you. Don't abuse that. I had someone do that to me. There was this guy who claimed that he was sending all his money to help his parents who lived in another city. And he kept on borrowing money from people, and then the 7th year came. So this was 7 years ago. I worked in this place, and the 7th year came. He ran away. He owed a lot of money to different people, and he ran away and vanished. And people tried to find him. And then there was a whole discovery there about what he was actually doing. But the point was that he was abusing the sabbatical year to run away from a debt, and that's not how it's supposed to work. If you want people to help you, you need to care about the people that give it to you as well. Not just give me, and then run away. You have to respect the fact that others want to help you. But on the other hand, if your brother is taken, for example, if your brother is sold as a slave to a foreigner, then it's your responsibility to redeem it. You have a responsibility to help your brother. And one of the helps that you have to go through is also redeem your brother if he's sold outside of your people. But other than that, there's really, I don't see any case in the Torah where the term tzedakah, which by the way is misappropriated today. It's not biblical Hebrew, it's actually latter Hebrew. The term tzedakah really means righteous deeds, not charity as giving monetary help. But the Torah obviously also says, love thy brother as thyself. When someone says to you, I see a poor man in the street, you're not going to walk around and say, okay, I'm giving you, here's 50 shekels, and make sure you give it back to me. Here's my address, and make sure you give it back to me until just before the sabbatical year. You don't do that. I think it's not in our nature to do stuff like that. So I think the Torah is also not talking about here about people who are looking for charity and so on. I think that the reality, what we're looking at here, is that you have a brother, and brother mean even a neighbor and so on, and they get into financial trouble. And you as a community, you want to help this person. So the people in the community step up and say, listen, we're going to lend you the money and pay us back when you can. We're not talking about seeing a man in the street asking for charity. That's something else. That's a normal good deed. We're talking about something a lot more complex than that. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. I hope it's opened up different windows of material that you can think about or clarify questions people might have. This is a hot topic right now, and there's a lot of discussion in the world about this subject, especially led by certain friends of mine. And by the way, I have to clarify this. The people who hold to certain opinions like this, these are actually people I know personally, and these are people I hold as friends. And disagreeing with someone doesn't mean that you hate them. It doesn't mean that you're challenging their faith or anything. What it actually means is that I'm in disagreement with you. It doesn't mean we can't be friends. This specific person, when he comes to Israel, if we can meet up, we sit, we laugh, we talk, we share material, we're friends. It doesn't contradict. Disagreeing doesn't contradict the ability to be friends. It's not a challenge on your faith. It's a challenge on your opinion, if anything. So I hope you enjoy this. Don't forget to visit the website HebrewInIsrael.net. Don't forget the Facebook page, and also like and subscribe if you're on the YouTube channel. And if what I've done here has blessed you, please consider helping out with the work to find material. The types of books that I use are very, very expensive. So if you do find in your heart to help out, I welcome it. If you can't, no problem. I'm still going to put out information. As I have a saying, lack of money is not a reason not to teach. I actually have people that I teach for free. People who send me a lot of questions, and they say, oh, yeah, it doesn't matter, or people who want to speak with me every once in a while. I have no problem with that. I just tell them, don't try not to abuse this. But at the end of the day, it is work. It does take time. So if you find in your heart, it'll be very helpful. In any case, if you listen to this during Shabbat Shalom, before or after Shabbat, I hope you enjoyed your week. And we have one more recording left for this series. As I said, I might actually expand this into Bamidbar a little bit more, because the first recordings I did were very, very short. They were like 15, 20 minutes long. I might do a few more recordings for Bamidbar and Nasa, and maybe a little bit more. But basically, next week is the last recording for Tzor LaMikra. And everything that follows that is going to be recordings I did last year. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff that I put out there. There's stuff I put on Talking Torah. There's stuff I put on Truth to You. I have, as I said, I have plans for a few other projects that I'm thinking about. But in any case, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've enjoyed the entire series. I know that a lot of people have joined the series later on because they didn't know the series existed. So obviously I'm going to put up on SoundCloud, on YouTube. Everything is going to show up in these mediums to make sure that if you've ever missed anything, you'll have access to them. SoundCloud, by the way, is strongly recommended because you can actually get it as an app on your smartphone, and you can actually download the recordings as well. And if I'll be able, I'm still trying to figure out how to do this. There's some problem with it, but if I can put it also up on iTunes, I think that will also help a lot of people, and there'll be another medium people can work on. And I also have a plan to feature my material on TuneIn Radio. I need to speak with them to see if they agree to feature, a podcast style thing. But as far as I know, they do. So hopefully that will be up there as well. Basically, you can be able to access the recordings from wherever. So again, Shabbat Shalom. Hope you enjoy this, and Kol Tov.